Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Slacky. I work for AAA Northeast, and we are very excited to welcome you to our webinar this morning, Red Light Cameras, What to Know Before Giving Them the Green Light. Not the best pun in the world, but I think we made do. I enjoyed it. So hopefully you got a little chuckle out of it as well. We're here this morning to talk about red light cameras. I know I'm one of maybe 10 people in the world that could talk for hours about this topic. I'm super excited and interested and passionate about it. So we want to keep you informed. We want to keep you entertained. So we hope it'll be a very engaging presentation this morning. You may notice that you're seeing the slides, but you're not seeing our faces. We are having some technical difficulties with the webcams this morning, so we apologize for that. We'll see if we can make that happen, but if not, you'll have to listen to our sweet dulcet radio voices. So I'll be sure to make mine like a nice morning DJ for y'all. But without further ado, I want to pass it over to Jeff Coleman. Jeff is the Superintendent of Public Works for Scarsdale and is also the president of the New York Metropolitan Chapter of the American Public Works Association. And we're delighted to be co-hosting it with Jeff this morning and excited for the partnership. And so Jeff, take it away.
Thanks, Alec. I'd first like to thank AAA for agreeing to put this on for the membership. The New York Metropolitan Chapter of the American Public Works Association's mission is to provide educational opportunities for its membership, and that's been challenging as of late due to COVID. But this is a very topical subject and of interest to the members. And then also joining us are several members of the Westchester County Association of Municipal Public Works Administrators, as well as the local chapter of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. So I see that we have quite a few attendees. I know this was a webinar that was long in the making and it got put off due to COVID. And I appreciate the fact that AAA stayed with it and is providing it to us. So thank you, Alec, Lauren, and your team for agreeing to put this on today. Thank you.
Oh, it's our pleasure, and we're delighted that you and the rest of the folks could join us, and delighted to have all the attendees here with us this morning. We're going to hear a little bit later from my colleague Lauren Paterno about some of AAA's recommendations on red light cameras that have been developed in partnership with some other great safety advocates, as well as from Tom Soik, who has experience managing a red light camera program in White Plains. And we know red light cameras have been a super hot topic all around New York State, particularly downstate, but across the state. But I want to start it off with just a little bit of discussion about what the national trends are when we're seeing red light cameras. So Mark, if you want to click through a couple slides. So, one question for the red light camera industry is, has it peaked? We saw giant growth the first decade this century and some gradual decline. We were at a peak of about 500, I think, in 2012 or 2013. And then we're down to under 400 this year. So what's happened? Mark, you can click through a couple times. So what might have happened to give people a reason to think that they might not want red light cameras? I wonder what it could be. But actually, of course, as you see on the screen, there have been a lot of scandals related to the red light camera industry. Different companies, different municipalities. Thankfully, we have not had any real scandals here in New York, and I think that's a tribute to the state law and also the diligent work of a lot of folks. It doesn't mean there haven't been controversies, but I would say there haven't been any scandals like this. So Mark, if you want to click through. But I think when we see those scandals pop up over and over again across the country. This is from the AAA Traffic Safety Culture Index, which is an annual survey that our AAA Foundation does. And it shows really growing opposition and waning support for red light cameras. And that's leading to that backlash, that's leading to that decline in red light camera usage that we see. So, if you go to the next slide, why do we want to host this program? What's our interest? And what's my interest in particular? So this is me testifying at Suffolk County, I guess 6 years ago, and I had, I was a little more kempt than I am today, maybe during COVID. But if you want to click next, Mark, you can see that this is posted by redlightscam.com. I did not talk to them. I did not interact with them at all, but they found me giving some constructive feedback on the county's red light camera program, and they put it on their redlightscam.com that thinks basically red light cameras are a scam. And that's not where AAA wants to be. AAA knows that these camera programs can work to save lives and reduce injuries. But we also know that it takes a lot of diligence on the part of the municipal officials. We don't want to be in the place where we're criticizing the programs. We want to be in a place where we're working together to make the programs work well. And that's why we wanted to convene everyone this morning. So Mark, if you want to click to the next slide, I wanted to talk just for a couple minutes about the reasons why people don't like red light cameras and some of the biggest considerations if you are looking to start or even continue implementing a red light camera program. And the big two really is that they think cameras can make mistakes, and the focus is on the revenue, not safety. So we'll talk about the money issue first, Mark, if you want to click through. So some money mistakes, freely admitting that red light cameras are primarily aimed at raising revenue. This should be about safety. That's what all the stated claims should be about. But this is the 2008 and 2009 New York State budget, where we authorized red light camera programs under the heading of providing targeted revenue flexibility for New York City and some of its suburbs, as well as a couple upstate cities. So that's, I would say mistake number one is saying this is about raising revenue. Another mistake that you can make, if you want to click through, is dedicating revenue to a non-safety purpose. And St. Louis did exactly this. This is a few years ago, but they said we're going to dedicate all revenue from red light cameras to funding more police. And that is not narrowly focused on traffic safety. In fact, it's dedicating that revenue to something that may not be focused on traffic safety. We don't know. And I think that is, that's a mistake. And there's plenty of other places that have said we're going to use this revenue for X, Y, or Z that has nothing to do with traffic safety. So it makes it look like it's about raising revenue and also overestimating revenue. This happened in Albany. Their first year that they had red light camera programs. Actually, I think if the program was started pretty judiciously when it got off the ground, maybe in 2015 up in Albany, but the mayor had budgeted for $2 million in revenue and only got 100 grand, and so it makes it look like a problem when you don't get as much revenue as you hope for, when actually it's a good thing, either because the program is proceeding in a pretty judicious and deliberate manner, or you had less violations than you hoped for. So that if you, especially in those first couple of years, it's better to be very, very conservative on your revenue estimates. If you want to click through, Mark. And is this fair? Well, not necessarily. The media is going to focus on the money. There's no doubt about that. But as you can see from some of these headlines, a red light camera program is a money loser. Well, that's a good thing, right? It should be a good thing because that means there aren't as many violations. So no matter what, there's gonna be a focus on revenue. So I think your best defense is always to dedicate revenue to traffic safety. That way you can't really say, or no one can really say that the program is about raising revenue. You could say, well, this is about traffic safety. So I think revenue is always going to be a top consideration. And if you want to go to the next slide, accuracy concerns. I didn't run the red light, or it wasn't my car. These are common questions that people get. People ask me, and people ask AAA. And the best defense for these is video. Making sure that your program has video that you can show someone, hey, this is very, very clearly your car running a red light. It's clear as day. Video is pretty incontrovertible. Obviously, you need to make it available for folks to see online. And I think that's kind of part and parcel of a lot of the red light camera vendors. So that's a major concern for folks as well. The next concern I wanted to talk about is right on red. And that's something that we see in a lot of violations. And if you want to go to the next slide, this is from that same survey that this was actually done by the IIHS about why people, what do people feel about enforcing right on red violations. A bulk of the people said, hey, red light violations are not a problem. And the reality is that's not what red light cameras are designed to avoid. They're designed to avoid that T-bone crash. Of course, red light violations can be dangerous, but they aren't always. So if you want to go to the next slide, this is a violation from Nassau County at Lakeville Road and Marcus Avenue. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but you can click to play it. You're going to see a car go through right as the yellow light turns red. This is kind of a channelized right turn lane. There's no one crossing there. Look, you shouldn't have done it, but if you get that and you get a $150 ticket from Nassau County, you're not going to be happy. And the reality is, I don't think that is the violation that these camera programs are designed to prevent. But on the other hand, if you go to the next slide, this is a state senator from Cincinnati in Ohio, so no one in New York. This is a decade ago, and he was very opposed to red light cameras and said so in the legislature. And he said, it's all about Big Brother and the camera determining with instant replay accuracy that you didn't come to a full and complete stop. Then it came out that he himself had been ticketed by a red light camera. And if you go to the next slide, we can see his violation, and he turns right on red, and it isn't even close. He barely slows down. I would say that give this person a ticket every day and twice on Sunday. And so there is a balancing act there. That's a dangerous violation. And if there were a pedestrian crossing, he might not have noticed that person. So I think, it's important to say when you're looking at right on red, you put warning signs up, but also consider making the engineering changes to that intersection. Does it deserve a no turn on red sign? We don't want politicians making engineering decisions. I mean, we've had a lot of engineers on the call, and I think you all would like to have the autonomy to make the engineering decisions. So just because there's a camera up, that doesn't mean it deserves a no turn on red. But I think that's something that should be a consideration, just going through the intersection and making sure everything is where you want it to be before you start enforcing. And also giving a warning period to folks so they can adjust that behavior without getting a couple tickets. We can go to the next slide. I think equity is a big concern, and there are really two big concerns that are coming up right now, that the cameras are being placed mainly in communities of color, where we know a lot of roads are more dangerous in communities of color, and that fines are disproportionately burdening low-income drivers. So I think those are concerns that are especially important right now. So you have to make sure the site selection is very judicious, that it's based on the data, and that you get buy-in from local politicians, and to say that this is about safety. It's not about targeting any one group of people. Rochester actually, they canceled the red light camera program because then Mayor Lovely Warren was concerned about the impact on low-income drivers. So this is a concern that can be the downfall of a program. So you have to make sure, have a payment plan in effect if you can work with your courts to do that for folks who accumulate a couple violations, and make sure you are spreading out the cameras in a way that's based on data. I think the last issue that I want to talk about is just transparency. Better to freely distribute that information to everyone when you're talking about your evaluations of the program, how well it's working, as well as about how you're handling privacy, because I know that's a major concern for a lot of folks as well. I think that was the number 3 concern for people. So how are you handling that privacy? How are you making sure that people's information is protected? So these are all, pretty big considerations, important things to think about as you begin looking at a red light camera program. But I'll let Lauren talk a little bit about some of the more specific recommendations.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to first thank Jeff Coleman for his support and his collaboration on having this event. I met Jeff over a year ago at the Westchester County Traffic Safety Board meeting, and we were discussing having an event in person, but nevertheless, we were able to make it happen, virtually or not. So glad that we were able to bring it to fruition. First, I just want to give some background on the information that I'm going to provide. This presentation is going to be adapted from a checklist that was created in collaboration with the Advocates for Highway Safety, National Safety Council, IIHS, and AAA. So it's not created in a vacuum between Alec and I. This was really, these recommendations are created thoughtfully with a variety of safety stakeholders that really want to balance safety and see the program be successful. And in order to have a successful program, Mark, you can hit the next slide. You need to secure your resources and identify those resources. So if you do not have access to a traffic engineer, if you cannot have your public works staff devote and law enforcement devote time to a red light camera program, you probably won't be able to have a successful program within your community. You're also going to need to ensure that you have community and political support for the various reasons that Alec mentioned previously. And your first steps, as Alec mentioned, is you want to identify your intersections based on data, and it's data, data, data. So you want to look at your violation data, you want to look at your crash data. These should be the 2 drivers in which help you choosing your intersections where the cameras will go. Next, this is where your, sorry, Mark. Next is where you want to, this is where your traffic engineer comes into play. They need to ensure that the road meets guidelines and the signal timings meet guidelines. So you're going to need a traffic engineer right off the bat to ensure things are going to be able to get up and running appropriately. You can hit the next slide, Mark. One of the most important aspects of starting a red light camera program is open communication. You need to educate the public, educate your stakeholders, and make sure you get buy-in from the local politicians in the area as well. One great way to do this is to establish an advisory committee. This was just done out in Suffolk County for school bus cameras. Depending on the type of program, it's going to depend on which stakeholders you have. For example, they had members of their PTA, local PTAs out there, pupil transportation as a stakeholder, but you want to create a variety of stakeholders which represent the larger community, because they are your connection to the community and they are your connection to support within the community. Mark, you can keep clicking. Thanks. And you want to make sure that the community, that the advisory committee has a clear idea of what their role and responsibility is. So for example, out in Suffolk County, each stakeholder provided recommendations for what they thought would be a successful rollout of the program. So you want to make sure that the committee is well thought out and that they each understand their responsibility. You also, at the beginning of a program, you want to meet with the media to build support so they are aware that this is happening, and they can actually be a great link to the public and help you build support right from the very beginning. So once you have kind of established those communication steps, you're really going to start your implementation plan. And again, you're going to select your intersections based on data. You're going to need to establish a contract with a vendor, And you want to ensure that the vendor is charging you based on the services provided and not the number of citations. And I think Tom will speak a little bit later about managing that relationship with the vendor. And you also want to be sure that you develop a method for handling any problems that might arise. So there's two types of problems which could occur. You're going to have the technical glitches where you want to have a point person on hand for, but there also might be technical problems in terms of the things that you need to communicate with the public around. If drivers are being ticketed twice for whatever reason accidentally, you want a plan in place to communicate efficiently and quickly with the public, so that way they can continue you can continue maintaining that trust. Next, publicize, and educate. You want to ensure that you publicize that there's a safety problem. This is probably the best way to start a program, is to say there is a safety problem in our community that we need to solve. And a great way to do this is to link it to a safety initiative that you already have. If you have a Vision Zero program in your community, great, link it to that. So that way you are getting the buy-in from the community around the safety message. Hold a kickoff event with your advisory members. Again, they are your link to the community, and they are a great way to educate the public and really get the program off to the right start. You can do social media events with the advisory committee as well. So you really want to provide a way to really educate the greater public. You want to ensure that you have a website. The website should have all the details of the program, such as how to pay a ticket and how to dispute a ticket as well. And as Alec mentioned, you want to establish a probationary warning period. This gives drivers time to learn where the new cameras are going to be, but also be able to change their behavior, and you will have a lot less anger within the community if they know what to expect. Managing violations is probably one of the most, I would say, tricky parts of instituting a red light camera program, because as Alec mentioned, it needs to be a balancing act. You want to target the most dangerous violations, those violations which are really egregious and that you know are poor driving habits. And then you want to create this balancing where you're not over ticketing, because once you start over ticketing a community, you're going to have backlash and people are going to get upset. One way you can do this is disregard those right on red violations when there is nobody else present there. So it's really going to be this push and pull to really get a balance of, providing the tickets for people who are doing the wrong thing, but not over ticketing the community. And as Alec mentioned, we strongly believe, and all the safety advocates which help to create these guidelines strongly believe, that at least a portion of that revenue should go back into traffic safety programs. It really helps instill trust and helps keep the program transparent and effective. So long term, so every time I think of one of these red light camera programs, I think of this infomercial from the 90s where it's set it and forget it. This is exactly what you do not want to do for a red light camera program. These programs are not a set it and forget it type of program. If you do all the great work at the beginning to get the program up and running, you're using your traffic engineers, you're doing all the education, you're making your partnerships, and you've done all this great work, it doesn't end there. You have to keep going. And you need to do at least annual program reviews. So you need to verify your calibrations and synchronization with signals, which is, I think, required now by state law. And you need to evaluate your crash and infraction data. This should be done at least once a year, because this is going to tell you if your program is working. So if you are seeing that sometimes in certain locations, crashes and injuries may go up, and you might have to take a closer look at why that might be occurring. Or you might find that as you're evaluating the program, there's a new camera location that might be more effective for a red light camera. So you need to continuously look and monitor at your program to make sure it's still working and doing the right things. Next, again, it goes back to publicizing and maintaining that communication. You want to publicize your evaluation results. By New York State law, you have to do a report annually. The best way to do this is to put it on the website. The City of Albany puts theirs on their website. The City of New York puts theirs on their website. It's a great way to build trust in the program and be able to publicize how the program is doing. Anytime you have a new camera location, there should be a new warning period, and you should use social media, use your advisory committee to publicize those new locations. And again, you want to continue to meet with your advisory committee. That can be done on an annual basis, or anytime there's a reevaluation of the program. And again, meet with the media. Use them to your benefit. If crashes and injuries are going down, tell them, because they can really help you buy and trust. Because if you're not using them and they find out that something's going on, the media can easily turn against you. So you really want to get out and ahead and use education and communication prior to anything going awry. And yeah. And next up, and before I introduce Tom, I just want to say, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. We'll have a little Q&A at the end. So that way, if any questions coming in, our panelists can answer your questions. We can have time for Q&A. But Tom Soik, he is the Deputy Commissioner of Transportation for the City of White Plains. He is also the past president of the New York and New Jersey chapter of ITE, and he is the past chairman of ITE District 1, which I think is New York, New Jersey, and I think all of New England. And I have to say, he is also a AAA alumni. He was a traffic engineer for us, I think, when we were Auto Club of New York, and Tom will be able to give you some great tips on how they have instituted their program in the city of White Plains. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. I'll just say, first of all, that one of our prime considerations when we started the program was to emphasize safety, to improve safety. The mayor, expressed an interest in doing it, had an early discussion with me where I told him that I wasn't interested in doing it unless that was the primary focus. And so, we took that kind of approach, but it's definitely a process to follow. In August of 2015, the state allowed smaller communities like White Plains to institute a program. And it was about 3 years before we actually had the program issuing notices of violation. And we were not moving slowly. We were trying to do things, correctly, but keeping at it, and it takes a while. So just going briefly through that, first the city had to adopt its own local legislation. There was kind of a little bit of overlap of that with sending out an RFP to potential vendors. We got 5 respondents to that initial RFP. Then we had to meet with vendors, do interviews, try to, make a choice. And so once we did choose a vendor, then it was going through the process of establishing a contract. And there's a lot of detail that goes into that. I can't remember the total number of pages in the contract between the vendor and the city, but it was pretty significant. And a lot of questions had to be answered in order to, make that work properly. And I think one of the key kind of take backs from that was that you have to be careful that you set up a system where you aren't going to lose money. And we did make an agreement with our vendor that, that wouldn't be the case, that even if we chose locations where there was less revenue than what would be needed to meet the monthly fee for the camera, that they would not charge us money for that. So the city would be whole even if there was less revenue. And the rent, coincidentally, for almost every vendor was about $3,800 per month per camera. I don't know, how that ended up being the number, but that's what it is. And so, there's a fair number of tickets that have to be given out to make up that before you're actually making any money. We actually thought in the beginning that we probably wouldn't make that much revenue based on the locations that we chose. But the next step was to choose those locations, and I did a significant crash review of the city. First started out with a top 25 intersection list, came up with some crazy matrices that made the vendor a little dizzy, but in the end we modified that and came up with a list of high accident approaches. And that's really what you need to do, because you have to, look at where you're putting the camera. It's on one approach typically of an intersection. And so that should be the one where you're going to get the best bang for the buck in terms of reducing serious accidents. And we typically looked more so at 3 types of accidents: angle accidents, left turn opposing, and pedestrian accidents. Those are accidents that have the highest number of injuries. And so we end up getting a better reduction, at those locations where there are high numbers of those. And we chose 6 approaches in the end. We started to go with only 6 cameras to begin with, just to make sure that we had everything right, and just to kind of test the system. We had approval for 12 intersections where we could have done every approach at all 12 of those intersections. So we just did 6 approaches. There's actually 5 intersections. On one of those first intersections, we did 2 approaches. Those cameras were installed, but we first had to design them, and we had issues in terms of making the connection between the camera and the traffic control box. So there were other design issues that had, other hurdles that had to be made in order to even get the design completed. And once the design was done, then there was an installation process. It took about 3 or 4 months to do the installations. And finally, on July 2nd, 2018, this was after approval, initial approval to do it in August of 2015, we were able to start the program at those 6 locations. We did do a month of warnings where we had signs up before we issued any violations. And then in August of 2018, we issued violations. We did get some complaints, and we made some adjustments. But overall, I think the system has been, fairly well received by most people. There was a lot of public support. We did not have a committee specifically set up for this, but we did run it through the Transportation Commission, which is a transportation safety committee that meets on a monthly basis. And we continue to review aspects of the program, through both department officials in the city, as well as community representatives. And just some quick results in terms of what's happened for the first 6 locations. After about a year, we had a 26% reduction in those higher injury accidents, the angle, left turn, and pedestrian accidents, 15% reduction in injury crashes. And people always think that you're going to increase rear end collisions. Overall, even though I think there was 1 or 2 cases with all of our locations where we had an increase in rear end collisions, the overall reduction in rear end collisions of 44% for that first year for those 6 locations. For the second year, which includes a little bit of overlap, it's really not a fair comparison, a little bit of overlap with the lockdown due to the COVID virus. There was a 45% reduction in the angle, left turn, and pedestrian accidents, 42% in injuries, and 57% reduction in rear end collisions at the locations where we have the cameras. So overall, we feel like it has been effective in reducing some crashes. I'll just say one more comment in terms of what's happened in the city, and that is before the lockdown in January and February of 2020, we had the lowest number of injuries for each of those 2 months than we've had in the last 50 years, and that's as far as we go back with data. So I think it was having an overall, and that was citywide. That was not just for the intersections where we had cameras. So I think it was having some residual effect at other intersections. That's what I have for now.
Thanks, Don. That was great. Obviously, obviously those results are pretty compelling, and we're glad to hear them. We know you're doing a lot of great work in a variety of areas, but it really seems like the cameras were done in a way that really boosted safety. So I know we have a couple questions from the audience, but I have a couple questions that I just wanted to start with first. As you were talking, you talked about getting, I think, 5 responses for the RFP, and they all were fairly similarly priced. How did you go about deciding which vendor you would choose?
Well, we did have discussions with other communities who had had some experience with these vendors. So that kind of played into our decision. Yeah, we thought it might be a question of cost, but that really wasn't a factor. And then we also had really a committee that met with them that asked a lot of questions. So was based on their responses to a lot of those questions, how we chose a vendor. We also were very interested in making sure that we could get good response in terms of maintenance of the equipment. So there was a factor of using a company that already had, some presence in the area and could, more effectively, maintain the equipment and respond if we had problems.
And thanks. And you mentioned kind of towards the beginning of the program, you had a little bit of complaints, and then you made some tweaks. Can you talk about what some of the tweaks that you made initially? And I mean, you're going to get complaints when people get tickets. That's bound to happen. But how did you tweak the program in those first for a few months to a year?
Well, I mean, we did before we even started double check all of the timings, and we did have to make some slight adjustments in the timings. We do try to follow the guidelines as much as possible, but even if you do that, you got to be careful that you have everything correct. And people did complain about the timing, claiming that in some cases the yellow was too short, or there were other issues with timing. So at least we were able to verify that was not true. And you do indicate what the times are. There's actually equipment that measures the time, and that's that connection between the traffic signal controller cabinet and the actual camera, where they will monitor those times. And so that time is actually put on the summons, and they can look at that. Some people don't always do that, but we remind them that that information is there. And like you said before, I think it is key to have a video clip. A lot of people did not click on the video, or maybe didn't have the equipment where they felt they could do that, or the the knowledge, the technical knowledge to be able to do it. When people did come in to fight, if they were coming in to question the summons, we did have a monitor available outside the courtroom where they could see the video before they even went in. And about 9 out of 10 that came to court actually didn't even go into the courtroom once they saw the video.
That's pretty compelling. They just saw it and said, "Oh, I give up."
Wasn't worth it.
I think a philosophical question that I have, and I may be preaching to the choir to some extent with you and with the audience, but you mentioned it being important from a budgetary perspective that the county was, or sorry, the city was essentially held harmless. It wasn't going to cost the city anything. I think from AAA's perspective, if this is a safety intervention that is, if it costs money, just like you don't expect a law enforcement officer to make it back exactly his or her entire salary, or a speed bump is not supposed to bring in any revenue. If this is a safety thing, it should be okay that it costs money. But we've never been able to successfully pitch that argument to any municipality, really. Money is always a concern. So can you kind of talk about how that in that initial process you ended up on having that kind of held harmless contract?
Yeah, I guess you're right that there never seems to be enough money to do everything you like to do, and so you do want to be careful, that you're not going to get into a situation where you have to spend a lot of money, at least more than you anticipated, because we do have to operate under a budget. But I do think, that having that in there kind of kept both the city and the vendor honest in terms of when we were choosing locations, and we wanted to make sure that, both sides were happy with that, and that it was, the right location, that we did have, at least potentially a lot of violations at these locations that would be corrected, and there was a safety issue that needed to be corrected. And in the end, I think that did happen, and having that kind of a restriction helped that process along.
Makes sense. And one, getting a couple questions from the audience. I'd encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Someone's asking about your position on red light camera warning signs, and if you think those are helpful, either from a safety or from a political perspective.
I think it's important to have at least a sign at the locations. We did get some complaints that there weren't enough signs, and maybe that's just hard to say what, is the right number of signs or right location of the signs. I think one complaint was about the location of the sign. And we did make an adjustment, based on that. But the truth is, we did also a lot of public relations. We did meet with the media, and there was quite a bit of coverage about it when we first started the program. We also have information on our website where people can, see a lot of information about the program and how it works. So there was a lot of information out there. I think it's just another level of providing information to people. But in fairness to, some people, we do have some fairly wide streets in White Plains, and, typically there's one sign on the approach to the signal. And so, the argument could be made that you could add more signs. We do have a limited availability of putting signs at some of these locations. And sometimes you have, you struggle on where that sign should be. But I was pretty careful about making sure we had at least one, prominent sign at each approach.
That's great. And I mean, I'm sure some folks had maybe, legitimate complaints about this location of the signs, and some folks, you can't please everyone that gets a ticket. But I think another question that we're getting is about kind of political opposition. How can political opposition be overcome? And it seems like, we know you had buy-in from the mayor on, the city council. Was there any skepticism, any opposition about the camera program?
There was. When we first started the program, I think there were a few council members that had questions about it, and they wanted to know more about, how many red light collisions had occurred, people going through red lights and causing a collision in the past. I had to provide some background data in that regard. And there were a few that, were opposed to it. So it wasn't unanimous in terms of approving the program.
Mm-hmm. And I that questioner asked about, New Jersey's camera program that ended in 2014, and the final report is still, a work in progress. And I think that just goes to the importance of, transparency and making sure that the data is out there, good and bad, and you make whatever tweaks you need to based on that. But I guess along with that, have there been any locations that you went back to and you said, like, hey, this is working well overall, but this one location, maybe it's not as great? Or was it all, pretty much working well across the board?
Well, we haven't removed any locations, so there haven't been any adjustments like that yet. We really haven't had the cameras out there that long. I mean, I think there has been some reduction in the number of tickets that are issued at some of these locations, kind of factoring in the lockdown and the impact from, over the last year. So it's hard to say, whether all those locations at this point really should, continue to be operating. There's a significant variable in terms of how many tickets you get at each location. And I think it is hard to predict, even with a pretty detailed analysis of the crashes, where you're going to get the most, violators. But overall, and that was really what we were looking at, there was a significant number of violators. And I would say even the lowest intersection was still only slightly below, what the amount per month, that rental fee would be. So, collectively there was enough revenue, and in fact more than we really had anticipated. And that revenue has gone down, with the COVID impact. But our volumes have while they were down to a little bit less than 40% during the least traveled time, that first few months of the lockdown, they've kind of crept up again to somewhere between 75 and 80% of normal. So there's still significant traffic out there. I mean, I think the patterns have changed. You're not getting the same peak hour volume percentages that you would before, but you're still getting on a 24-hour basis fairly significant traffic volumes, and we still are getting people who are not, obeying the rules and going through. And another key thing that we did was we did put in a grace period, which I think I probably failed to mention in my discussion, and that was something that I think was difficult because there really isn't a lot out there in terms of how to decide what that grace period should be. We settled on 0.4 seconds. I think there are a few communities around the country that do 0.5. I don't think anyone does more than that. And a number of communities do a lot less than that. But I did take a look at the formula that's used for calculating your yellow change interval for traffic signals, and using that came up with what I felt was a reasonable grace time. And so a lot of people who felt like they got the ticket, the instant it turned red, we showed them that that wasn't the case, and that there was, some leeway there.
No, that's a great point. That's definitely, I think, helpful for people. They're not, getting a ticket for being a tenth of a second after the light, and I think having that grace period might help be one of the reasons that rear end crashes haven't increased like we've seen in some other places, where folks are really worried that if they're a split second, an instant right after the light turns red, that they're going to get a ticket, knowing that they don't need to slam on the brakes every time that they see, a yellow light coming on. That might be, that's just a hypothesis, but that might help there.
It could be, but I was a little surprised with how high those, reductions were in the real, and it was overall for all the locations. There were some locations that had a slight increase, but I kind of expected really that there would be a slight increase overall, and that didn't happen. In fact, it was significant reduction, which I still haven't been able to figure out why that it's such a large reduction.
No, that's great. And you mentioned, I think getting approval in 2015, and then finally starting the program in 2018. So it took, almost 3 years. And like you said, you weren't dilly-dallying, you weren't delaying, you were judiciously planning the whole time. For the folks on the call who might be looking to start red light cameras in their own communities, what are some of the things that you ran into during those, 2-3 years that you might not have expected when you first signed on?
Well, I think, a big, area that took a lot of time was the contract between the vendor and the city. You do have to get the lawyers involved. And I don't know if we have any lawyers on the line, but, once you do get them involved, everything takes a little bit longer. And so that really took longer than we thought to work out those details, because you had the lawyers on both sides that had their own opinions about what could be done or couldn't be done. And choosing the vendors was something that we really didn't have like a definite answer right away. We had to really think about it and get together a number of times before we were convinced that we were choosing the right vendor. So it takes some time, and you have to recognize that. I mean, the other thing is, once you even gone through that whole process, like I said before, you still have to design the locations, and that factors into what you choose in the beginning too, because they're looking at sight distance issues. You want to make sure that you have a clear visibility with the camera location. There's a small range of where that camera can go on the approach so that it can be effective, and sometimes you can't find a spot where you really can get the right view. And so they wouldn't do that approach, even though it might meet the criteria, from the crash perspective. You can't put a camera there. There were a couple locations that were pretty high numbers of crashes that we couldn't do, for that reason. But in the end, I think we did do locations that were near the top of our list. And we did have to, work on that with the vendor to make sure that, we had the right ones.
No, that is definitely all, all important steps to the program. And you mentioned kind of the overall crash numbers and looking particularly at those T-bone crashes. Certainly in White Plains, there's a lot of pedestrian activity and bicyclist activity, and I know you're definitely focused on those vulnerable road users. Was that a consideration during the planning process?
I definitely think that we got the most support, from the council members because of the pedestrian injuries and the concern about that. I think the year before we started the program or started getting into doing the program, we had 92 pedestrian injuries in 1 year. And I think it was related to, kind of the increase in people being more distracted for a variety of reasons at that time. But it was becoming a big concern. And so that really kind of was part of the impetus in us getting into the program to try to reduce that number. And we did significantly reduce that number. That was the highest in a number of years when that occurred. I think it was either 2017 or 2016. I can't remember the number for sure, but it was a pretty high number for us.
Well, I'm glad, and I know you do a lot of other work on pedestrian safety issues. But glad this has been an important tool in the toolbox. I want to ask about the adjudication process, which I know is maybe not as much your bailiwick, but an important part of the process for sure. And you mentioned that a lot of the folks that went to have their tickets adjudicated, they just left before doing so because they saw the video. How was that process of bringing the court on board to make sure they know how to adjudicate these programs or these violations? And was there anything you learned from violations that might have gotten overturned?
Well, I think that what was most difficult about that was getting the judges to agree to look at the violations. They were very concerned when we first met with them that this was going to increase their workload significantly. And so that was part of the reason why we came up with putting the monitor outside the courtroom, so only so many people would get into the courtroom. It's only 1 day a month that we address that, I think, for half a day in the court, those issues, and it really hasn't become a big problem. But the judges were collectively concerned that it was going to become a big problem for them. And so far that hasn't occurred.
That's good. I mean, obviously, I don't know if we have any judges on the call, but certainly AAA would argue that, it's like other traffic violations. I know it's adjudicate, or it's issued more like a parking violation just to the owner of the vehicle, but these are important things for people to learn their lesson on. So it's important to have that adjudication process for sure. I wanted to ask about, from a political perspective, you talked about some of the council members being a little bit skeptical. How's the reaction been from the local media? I know, candidly, AAA has had some criticism of some other red light camera programs in the region. And, I will say not once have we ever said those municipalities shouldn't have red light camera programs. We've always said, we want them to be done well and done right. But what's been the media reaction to the program?
I think you get the typical skepticism from the media too. But I would say overall that they, were pretty accurate in, I guess, indicating, what our experience has been when I gave them some numbers, in terms of reductions in crashes and indicated, numbers like that, 92 pedestrian injuries that we were concerned about, when we first started the program. They were relatively supportive of, at least letting the city do what they do and see how that worked out. So we really got a lot of negative media coverage, and I think it helped, answering them and responding to them when they want to know what was happening.
And in terms of other, organizations that might be concerned about the cameras, something that we've seen not so much in New York, but definitely around the country, is concern from police officials that more and more cameras means less work from them. How did you get the buy-in from the police department?
Yeah, they were concerned too about extra work, but I'd say the police have been great in terms of what they've done. I think in our second round of camera installations, they actually identified a problem with that grace period, that it wasn't installed properly, and we actually threw out a number of summonses that were early sent out with the wrong grace period, or without a grace period at all at one location. So they monitor. That is part of the process, that a police officer has to look at each video and determine whether that is a legitimate notice of violation to go out, and then it's also reviewed by the vendor. So there's some fail-safe in place. I mean, nothing's perfect. That also helps to reduce your overall workload when it does get to the courts. And they've been pretty good at doing that. And I think they've realized too over time how it really has made an improvement in terms of safety.
Great. I think, we might have time for maybe one more question, and the last one from the audience we have is, does the implementation of the red light camera program generate interest or concern about possible speed camera program in the future? I know right now New York City and Buffalo are the two municipalities in the state that operate speed cameras. Is that on your radar screen at all?
Well, of course, we have to get approval before we can do it. And right now, I believe it's only approved for school zones, for larger communities or certain communities within the state. I mean, I think there are people who would like to see that happen, but I do feel that, the red light technology has been around longer, and so it's a little better refined. And in my opinion, it is kind of a measure of speed. If you're traveling too fast and you come up to a red light, or a light that's changing, you probably have less of a chance of correctly going through that intersection because of your speed. And so when you get a red light summons, oftentimes it is similar to what you would get in terms of a speeding ticket. So I think it has calmed the traffic by having these around the city. We were pretty careful to spread it out geographically so we would get an overall impact throughout the city. And it does seem to have, calmed the traffic in a way that has reduced speeds, at least on the roads, where we have these cameras.
Well, I think we're 1 minute till 11 o'clock. So, with that, I want to thank you, Tom, for all your insight. I know there are a bunch of communities in Westchester and the region that have cameras. I know Westchester is looking into having cameras, so I hope that they'll reach out to you and learn from all your work. Certainly want to thank Jeff Coleman for his partnership. I want to thank everyone for attending. And Lauren, do you want to have the last word?
No, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and Jeff and Tom. Also, if you have any questions, if you're a municipality that is thinking about a program, or if you're interested in the guidelines, which I went over, feel free to reach out to us. We can either put you in touch with somebody who can help you, or we can help you as well. So, we are a friend, and we are looking to help municipalities who want to implement these programs safely. So don't be hesitant to reach out to us.
All right, with that, everyone have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.